The humid Pacific air clung to everything that night, in June 1944. Through the curved glass of his fighter's canopy, Lieutenant Dale Haberman stared into absolute darkness. His aircraft, moon-happy, cut through the black sky like a silent predator. The Northrop P61 Black Widow lived up to its sinister name. Below them, Saipan's captured landscape stretched invisible beneath the stars. Japanese forces had once called this island home. Now it served American bombers preparing strikes against the homeland itself. But the war in these skies was far from over. For too long, enemy bombers had terrorized Allied positions after sunset. They struck without warning from the protective embrace of darkness. Ground crews never knew when death might rain from above. Sleep became a luxury few could afford. The sound of engines in the night meant potential disaster. Tonight, everything was about to change. The radio's static filled the cockpit. Ground control had spotted something approaching through the darkness. A single enemy bomber was making its way toward American positions. Lieutenant Ray Mooney crouched over his glowing radar screen in the aircraft's belly. Green blips danced across the circular display like electronic fireflies. What was about to unfold would reshape night warfare in the Pacific forever. The hunters were about to discover they had become the hunted. America was finally ready to claim ownership of the dark hours. The Pacific War had reached a turning point by 1944. Nearly 3 years of brutal island-hopping campaigns had brought American forces within striking distance of Japan itself. The Mariana Islands provided exactly what the United States desperately needed. Air bases positioned close enough to launch sustained bombing attacks against Japanese industrial targets. Military aviation had traditionally been a daylight pursuit. When darkness fell, aircraft returned to their bases. Human vision and primitive navigation equipment made night operations nearly impossible. The Second World War shattered these limitations forever. German forces had pioneered night bombing during the London Blitz. British defenders were forced to develop radar-equipped night fighters in response. Now, in the Pacific theater, Japanese bombers employed similar devastating tactics. They conducted night raids against Allied positions with little fear of interception. Japanese night bombing strategy was elegantly simple. Single aircraft approached targets under cover of darkness. Twin-engine bombers like the Mitsubishi G4M Betty or Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily flew at medium altitudes. They could drop their deadly cargo and vanish into the night before Allied fighters could scramble. The psychological impact was crushing. Allied troops lived in constant fear of invisible death from above. Conventional fighters were useless against these tactics. Even skilled pilots became essentially blind in darkness. They relied on luck and ground-based searchlights to locate enemy aircraft. American military leaders recognized the inadequacy of existing night defense systems. Revolutionary solutions were needed. An aircraft designed specifically for hunting in darkness. Electronic eyes that could pierce the blackest night were essential. Jack Northrop and his engineering team accepted this challenge. The United States Army Air Corps had issued specifications for a dedicated night fighter in 1941. London was burning under German night raids. The Battle of Britain raged with unprecedented fury. Northrop's response was audacious beyond imagination. The XP-61 resembled a medium bomber, more than a traditional fighter. This massive twin-engine aircraft would become the largest and heaviest fighter in the American arsenal. The design broke every convention of fighter aircraft construction. Twin booms extended backward from the wings. A horizontal stabilizer connected them at the rear. The crew nacelle was mounted centrally between the engines. This unusual configuration provided stability and space for the aircraft's revolutionary feature. A large radar dish was mounted in the nose. The SCR-720 radar system could detect aircraft at ranges up to 20 miles. This gave night fighter crews an enormous advantage over their prey. Radar represented only part of the equation. The Black Widow carried devastating firepower into battle. 4 20mm Hispano cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage. These weapons could shred enemy aircraft with explosive shells. A dorsal turret initially contained 450 caliber machine guns. This provided additional firepower from above. Later production aircraft removed this turret due to aerodynamic problems. The installation caused severe buffeting at certain airspeeds. The aircraft's 3-man crew operated as a coordinated team. The pilot controlled the aircraft and fired the fixed cannons. The radar operator monitored the electronic scope from below. He guided the pilot toward targets invisible in the darkness. When installed, the gunner operated the dorsal turret. This teamwork approach represented a revolution in fighter operations. Previous fighters had been single-seat aircraft. One pilot handled all combat tasks alone. Development challenges plagued the P61 program. The aircraft was enormous by fighter standards. It spanned 66 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Fully loaded weight exceeded 30,000 pounds. Early test flights revealed serious problems with the dorsal turret. Severe buffeting occurred at specific airspeeds. Many production aircraft were delivered without this troublesome installation. They relied solely on the 4 nose-mounted cannons. Production P-61s began rolling off Northrop's assembly line in 1943. The aircraft's distinctive black paint scheme earned its deadly nickname. This dark coloration made it invisible against the night sky. The Black Widow Spider became its perfect namesake. Test pilots were impressed by the aircraft's surprising handling characteristics. Despite its massive size, the P-61 remained remarkably maneuverable. It could perform aerobatic maneuvers that would destroy lesser aircraft. Training night fighter crews required completely new aerial combat tactics. Pilots had to learn flying primarily by instruments. They trusted radar operators to guide them toward targets they couldn't see. The radar operators needed extensive training to interpret green blips on their screens. Distinguishing between friendly and enemy aircraft was crucial. Split-second coordination between man and machine became essential. It was a delicate dance, performed in absolute darkness. Lives depended on perfect communication between crew members. The first P-61 squadrons began forming throughout 1943. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron at Guadalcanal received the new aircraft among the first units. Crews trained intensively for months. They learned the intricate systems of their complex machines. The Black Widow differed from every fighter that preceded it. Patience and precision replaced aggressive dog-fighting tactics. Night combat required different skills than daylight aerial warfare. The strategic situation in the Pacific was shifting dramatically as 1944 began. American forces prepared for their most ambitious campaign yet. The assault on the Mariana Islands would bring B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. Capturing Saipan, Guam, and Tinian would allow sustained bombing campaigns against Japanese industrial targets. Japanese commanders understood these islands' strategic importance perfectly. They prepared defensive positions and assembled aircraft to counter the expected assault. Seasoned night bomber crews had been conducting successful raids for months. These pilots had grown confident in their ability to strike and escape under darkness. They remained unaware that a new predator was entering their domain. Japanese night bombing campaigns had achieved remarkable success up to this point. Individual bombers flew alone to avoid detection. They approached Allied bases and dropped bombs before disappearing. The psychological effect on Allied ground crews was severe. Death could fall from the invisible sky at any moment. Sleep became a luxury few could afford. The sound of aircraft engines at night meant potential disaster for everyone below. Japanese bomber crews had developed sophisticated tactics for night raids. They approached at medium altitudes using cloud cover and terrain features. Once over targets, they dropped bombs quickly and turned for home. Course changes were frequent to avoid potential interception. The few times Allied fighters managed to scramble, Japanese aircraft were long gone. Interceptors reached altitude only to find empty sky. This tactical advantage was about to change dramatically. Unknown to Japanese commanders, P61 Black Widows were being assembled at airfields across the Pacific. These electronic predators were designed specifically to hunt aircraft like theirs. Radar could penetrate the darkness that had been their shield. The night that had been Japan's ally was about to become their enemy. Everything was changing in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron received their first P-61s in early June 1944. Aircraft arrived partially disassembled at Guadalcanal's Kearny Airfield. Ground crews worked to put them together piece by piece. The sight of these massive black aircraft created quite a stir. They looked sinister and purposeful against the tropical landscape, like mechanical vultures waiting to take flight into the darkness. Lieutenant Dale Haberman was among the first pilots to fly the P-61 operationally. An experienced aviator, he had previously flown the converted P-70 night fighter. The Black Widow's capabilities struck him immediately. Unlike the improvised P-70, which was essentially a converted attack bomber, the P-61 had been designed for night fighting from conception. Every system had been optimized for operations in darkness. From radar to flight controls, everything served the night mission. The aircraft's radar system was particularly impressive to crews. The SCR-720 could track multiple targets simultaneously. It displayed them as glowing blips on a circular screen. The radar operator could determine direction and distance of enemy aircraft. Altitude and speed information was also available. For the first time in aviation history, night fighters could hunt with precision. Luck was no longer the primary factor in night combat. P-61 crews conducted extensive training flights over the Pacific throughout June 1944. They familiarized themselves with their aircraft's revolutionary capabilities. The Black Widow's size and twin-engine configuration made it stable and forgiving. Pilots could concentrate on following radar operators' guidance. They didn't struggle to control difficult aircraft in darkness. This stability was essential for successful night operations. Japanese forces continued their night bombing operations meanwhile. They remained unaware that their tactics were being studied by American intelligence. Each raid provided valuable information about Japanese night operations. Preferred altitudes, approach routes, and timing were all noted. This intelligence would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. Old and new ways of fighting in darkness were about to collide. The first operational P-61 mission took place on June 25, 1944. Lieutenant Haberman and radar operator Lieutenant Mooney lifted off from Saipan. Moon Happy was loaded with fuel and ammunition for the patrol mission. The mission was routine, designed to familiarize crews with operational conditions. They found nothing that night in the empty Pacific sky. But the precedent had been established. The Black Widow was now hunting. Japanese bomber crews maintained their confidence in darkness operations. They continued their raids against Allied positions. They had no idea that electronic eyes were watching the night sky. Their every move was being tracked by invisible radar beams. The era of Japanese night supremacy in the Pacific was ending. They didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. The stage was set for a confrontation that would revolutionize night warfare forever. On one side were experienced Japanese bomber crews. Veterans of hundreds of successful night raids regarded darkness as their ally. On the other side were American airmen equipped with revolutionary technology. They possessed electronic systems that could turn night into day. The invisible was about to become visible. Lieutenant Haberman and his crew prepared for what they thought would be another routine patrol. The night of June 30th, 1944, approached with no indication of its historical significance. They had no idea they were about to score the first P61 victory in Pacific theater combat. Their encounter would mark the beginning of the end for Japanese night operations. It would herald the dawn of a new era in aerial warfare. The darkness that had protected Japan for so long was about to become their shroud. The Black Widow was ready to strike its prey. Electronic eyes glowed in radar screens. Powerful engines whispered through the night air. A revolution in night warfare was about to begin. In the distance, a lone Japanese bomber made its way through the darkness. The crew believed they were heading toward another successful raid. They had no way of knowing that death was stalking them. Electronic eyes could see through the blackest darkness. The hunt was finally about to begin. June 30th, 1944, began like countless other nights in the Pacific theater. Japanese bomber crews prepared for routine raids against American positions on Saipan. For months, these night operations had proceeded with virtual impunity. Darkness had been their protective shield against Allied fighters blind in the black Pacific sky. Everything was about to change on this particular night. History was waiting in the humid darkness above the ocean. Lieutenant Dale Haberman settled into Moon Happy's cockpit. He ran through pre-flight procedures with practiced efficiency. Below him, in the aircraft's belly, radar operator Lieutenant Ray Mooney powered up the SCR-720 radar system. The circular screen came to life with its characteristic green glow. Neither man realized they were about to make aviation history. In just hours, they would score the first P-61 victory in Pacific theater combat. Japanese confidence in night operations would be shattered forever. The mission began with routine procedures. Moon Happy lifted off from Saipan's airstrip and climbed into the humid Pacific night. Twin Pratt and Whitney engines hummed with reassuring power. The massive fighter settled into its assigned patrol pattern. Haberman flew by instruments alone. His eyes scanned dimly lit cockpit gauges. Mooney monitored the radar scope below in the aircraft's belly. The darkness outside was absolute and complete. No moon was visible through the cloud cover. No stars penetrated the overcast sky. Perfect hunting weather had arrived at last. At approximately 11:30 that evening, Mooney's voice crackled through the intercom. His words would echo through aviation history forever. Contact bearing 270, range 15 miles. On his radar screen, a bright blip had appeared. It moved steadily toward Saipan's Allied positions. After months of training and preparation, the Black Widow had found its first prey. The target was a Mitsubishi G4M2 Betty bomber. One of the workhorses of Japanese night operations was approaching through the darkness. Its crew of 7 men had no idea they were being stalked. An invisible predator was tracking their every movement. The Betty's pilot maintained course and altitude with complete confidence. Darkness had protected him on dozens of previous missions. The bomber's gunners scanned the night sky with their naked eyes. They remained unaware that electronic sensors tracked their aircraft precisely. Haberman banked Moon Happy to intercept course. He followed Mooney's calm directions through the intercom. Turn left, heading 240. Range now 12 miles and closing. The P-61's radar tracked the enemy bomber with precision. This would have seemed like magic to fighter pilots just years earlier. The Japanese crew flew in what they believed was total invisibility. They had no idea that death approached from behind and below. Electronic eyes had pierced their protective darkness. As the range closed steadily, Mooney provided continuous updates. 8 miles, 6 miles, 4 miles. The Japanese bomber continued its steady course toward target. The crew focused on navigation and target identification. In the Betty's cockpit, the pilot checked his maps carefully. He prepared for the upcoming bombing run. His gunners remained alert, but saw nothing in the black void. The night that had been their ally was about to betray them. At 2 miles range, Haberman began seeing the faint outline. The enemy aircraft appeared against the slightly lighter sky. The Betty flew straight and level, presenting a perfect target. Mooney's voice came through the intercom one final time. "Dead ahead. 1 mile. You should have visual contact now." Haberman pressed his firing button decisively. The P61's 4 20mm cannons erupted into deadly life. Explosive shells tore through the darkness with devastating precision. They found their mark with lethal accuracy. The Betty's right engine burst into flames immediately. Sheets of fire streamed back along the wing. The Japanese bomber lurched violently as hydraulic lines were severed. Control surfaces suffered massive damage from the cannon shells. The Japanese crew was thrown into complete chaos. Their invisible sanctuary had become a death trap. Warning lights flashed throughout the cockpit as systems failed. The aircraft began losing altitude rapidly. The pilot fought desperately with unresponsive controls. The damage was far too severe to overcome. Within seconds of the first cannon burst, the Betty was doomed to destruction. But the engagement was far from finished. As the bomber began its fatal descent, Mooney's radar detected another contact. "Another bogey, 3 o'clock high," he called out calmly. A Japanese fighter had been escorting the bomber at distance, probably a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. It had seen the tracer fire from the P-61's cannons. The fighter pilot was now diving to attack the American night fighter. This moment would truly test the Black Widow's combat capabilities. Night air combat was treacherous enough without engaging enemy fighters. Tracking a falling bomber while fighting another aircraft required exceptional skill. Haberman's extensive training took control of his actions. He maneuvered to avoid the attacking fighter's assault. The Japanese pilot flew by visual reference alone. He had only brief muzzle flashes from P-61 cannons to guide his attack. The Oscar pilot pressed his attack with typical Japanese determination. He fired a burst that passed wide of the Black Widow. But in the absolute darkness, he couldn't maintain visual contact. His target had disappeared into the night. Haberman used the P-61's superior maneuverability to his advantage. He banked sharply and dove toward the ocean's surface. The Japanese fighter couldn't follow the American aircraft in darkness. Unable to maintain contact, he was forced to break off engagement. Meanwhile, the crippled Betty continued its death spiral toward the Pacific. The bomber's crew fought desperately to maintain any control. The aircraft was beyond saving despite their efforts. Within minutes of being hit, the Betty crashed into the ocean. It exploded in a ball of fire, taking the entire crew. The first P-61 victory in the Pacific had been achieved. For the Japanese airmen involved, it was a catastrophic introduction to deadly new reality. Word of the successful intercept spread quickly through Allied commands. For the first time in Pacific War history, an American night fighter had successfully hunted down a Japanese bomber. The bomber had been operating under cover of darkness, as usual. The implications were profound and immediately recognized by military leaders. Both sides of the conflict understood the significance. History had been made in the electronic glow of radar screens. For Americans, the victory represented validation of years of development. The P61 program had cost millions of dollars in research and development. It required entirely new tactics and training procedures to implement. The successful engagement proved the investment had been worthwhile. American forces now possessed a weapon capable of challenging Japanese night supremacy. The balance of power was shifting dramatically. The reaction among Japanese commanders was quite different. Intelligence reports of the engagement reached Tokyo within hours. They painted a disturbing picture of new American capabilities. For years, Japanese night operations had been conducted with minimal losses. Experienced crews had accumulated hundreds of flight hours safely. They had developed sophisticated tactics under cover of darkness. The sudden appearance of effective Allied night fighters threatened everything. The entire strategic balance in the Pacific was at stake. Years of tactical advantage were evaporating overnight. Japanese aviation experts immediately began analyzing the engagement. They tried to understand how Americans had achieved precise interception in total darkness. The implications were staggering for their operations. If American fighters could hunt effectively at night, entire defensive strategies needed reconsideration. Hundreds of aircraft would become vulnerable during night operations. The psychological advantage of darkness would be lost forever. The success of Moon Happy was just the beginning of transformation. Within days of Haberman and Mooney's historic victory, other P-61 crews began scoring kills. Across the Pacific theater, Black Widows were finding their prey. On July 7th, a Black Widow from the 421st Night Fighter Squadron struck. Based in New Guinea, it shot down a Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-46 Dyna reconnaissance aircraft. Each success built confidence among Allied crews. Terror spread among Japanese opponents with each loss. The night that had protected them was becoming their enemy. Japanese response was swift, but ultimately ineffective against radar technology. Additional fighters were assigned to escort night bombing missions. These aircraft proved just as vulnerable to radar-guided attacks. The bombers they were protecting offered no additional safety. Japanese pilots trained for visual combat in daylight conditions. They found themselves at severe disadvantage against invisible enemies. Some Japanese commanders attempted to develop countermeasures against American radar. Flight patterns began using more varied approach routes and altitudes. They hoped to confuse Allied radar operators with unpredictable tactics. Others experimented with primitive electronic jamming equipment. These devices were largely ineffective against sophisticated American radar systems. The technology gap was simply too wide to bridge. A few units tried flying at extremely low altitudes. They hoped to avoid radar detection entirely at sea level. This tactic proved dangerous and reduced bombing accuracy significantly. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrews was devastating. Material losses were significant, but mental effects were worse. Pilots who had operated with virtual impunity now faced invisible enemies. Death could strike without warning from the black void. Stress from flying missions under constant threat began affecting morale. Crew effectiveness declined noticeably across Japanese night operations. American intelligence officers noted marked changes in Japanese behavior. Following the first P-61 victories, night operations decreased in frequency. Those raids that were attempted showed clear signs of increased caution. Japanese bombers flew more erratic courses through the darkness. They varied altitudes more frequently than before. These tactics reduced their bombing accuracy considerably. They provided little protection against radar-guided interception. P-61 squadrons continued accumulating victories throughout summer 1944. The aircraft's effectiveness exceeded even optimistic predictions of designers. Night after night, Black Widows prowled Pacific skies relentlessly. Their radar systems reached through darkness to find unsuspecting prey. Each successful intercept further eroded Japanese confidence in night operations. American technological superiority was being demonstrated conclusively. The impact extended far beyond simple aircraft losses. Japanese night operations had been crucial to their defensive strategy. They allowed attacks on Allied positions while minimizing casualties. The sudden vulnerability of night operations forced commanders to reconsider tactics. Resources had to be diverted to develop new defensive measures. Valuable aircraft were lost attempting to continue operations that were no longer viable. One striking aspect of early P61 operations was the psychological transformation. Japanese aircrews who had felt secure in darkness now experienced vulnerability. They felt the same helplessness Allied pilots had endured for years. The roles had been completely reversed through American technology. The hunters had become the hunted in electronic warfare. The technical superiority of P61 radar systems became apparent with each engagement. The SCR-720 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously. A single night fighter could engage several enemy aircraft in succession. Ground controllers monitored the electronic battlefield from radar stations. They could vector multiple P61s to intercept large enemy formations. Attacks were coordinated with unprecedented precision in darkness. Japanese attempts to counter the P61 threat met with limited success. Some units experimented with dropping metallic chaff to confuse radar. This tactic had achieved some success in European operations. However, primitive chaff available to Japanese forces was largely ineffective. American radar systems had sophisticated discrimination capabilities that defeated simple countermeasures. Other electronic countermeasures proved equally futile against American technology. The Black Widow's success extended beyond shooting down enemy aircraft. The mere presence of radar-equipped night fighters disrupted Japanese operations. Enemy formations would break up and scatter when detecting P61 approaches. They aborted missions rather than risk engagement with invisible hunters. This psychological effect multiplied the combat effectiveness of relatively few aircraft. By late 1944, the transformation of night warfare was complete. American P61 squadrons had established clear superiority in darkness. Japanese night operations became increasingly rare and ineffective. The aircraft designed to hunt invisible enemies had succeeded beyond expectations. It fundamentally altered the strategic balance throughout the Pacific theater. The success of the P61 program had implications extending far beyond Pacific War operations. The Black Widow demonstrated the potential of radar-equipped fighters conclusively. It paved the way for post-war developments in all-weather interceptors. Lessons learned from P61 operations would influence fighter design for decades. Tactics developed during night combat would remain relevant in modern warfare. As 1944 drew to a close, Japanese night supremacy had clearly ended. The Black Widow had lived up to its deadly reputation completely. It wove electronic webs that trapped enemy aircraft in darkness. The night that had been Japan's ally now belonged to America. Electronic eyes pierced the blackest skies with devastating effectiveness. The transformation was symbolized perfectly in the war's final months. On the night of August 14–15, 1945, Japan prepared to surrender. A P61 named Lady in the Dark encountered a lone Japanese fighter. In a fitting end to the night war, the enemy aircraft was forced into the ocean. The American crew never fired a single shot. The mere presence of the Black Widow spelled doom for its opponent. The P61 Black Widow had revolutionized night warfare completely. It turned Pacific darkness from Japanese sanctuary into American hunting ground. In doing so, it changed the tactical balance of war. The fundamental nature of aerial combat itself was transformed forever. The night would never again belong to those seeking to hide. Electronic eyes now pierced the blackest sky with precision. Death flew on silent wings through the Pacific night, guided by radar beams invisible to its prey. The age of electronic warfare had truly begun.